Thank you, Kevin. So thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I think you gave us a flavor of what is this mini guide, which is very interesting. And I will now start with some questions. I would like to give the floor to Rose Anang, for a question.
Training program. The people to be involved in the evaluation, the people you may need to consult, interview for the evaluation. For example, there could be a project and there are some key people who are supposed to be interviewed, you know, for their participation or their impression, observation of the project. And if these people are not consulted and the evaluation report is given, you know, how objective will be the report? Because other people who would have given some information were not contacted at all. So how do you find that the evaluation is quite objective? Because they are speaking to people who are already converted and not the other people who may have to, you know, give an impression.
Mm-hmm. So, so I'll try to give my sense, but I'm also inviting on all of those questions, I do invite Sylvia to also share her experience. She's worked with a lot of projects in the field, so I'll also invite her to jump in. But let me just react to this quickly. I think what you're describing is sort of a case of the a more traditional performance evaluation, where an independent evaluator maybe comes in, or sometimes even internal, and then usually what they do a lot of interviews with some people in the project, some of the beneficiaries, maybe some local stakeholders, to get a sense of how the project is working. And you're absolutely right. The challenge with that is to find a representative sample of those stakeholders involved and what they think about this. If you just do the interviews with who you know that is already convinced, or on the other hand, you could also just ask, you will bias the impressions and the actual effectiveness. And this is why it's important that, well, one is that usually those evaluations should be independent. So an independent evaluator usually has less interest to just ask those who seem to be more convinced. But actually find people across the community, different participants, different stakeholders in the project, to really get a broader sense of the impressions. And some of those people he interviews may have positive, and that's where the independence of the evaluator is usually very important. But the second with that is a question of how representative are the people that you ask, and that's is true even if you just look at your beneficiaries. Let's say you had 100 people in your training. Well, you know, there's always a few where we know that for them it worked well and they liked it, right? And if we sort of just focus on those, then we are likely to get the wrong impression of the project. And this is why it's important to really have a representative sample of people, and that's why we do the question of random. If you randomly select who you're going to ask, well, most likely you'll have people who liked it and some who didn't. If you sort of go in and maybe showed up to, you know, that day to answer your questions, it's very possible that you have people that are maybe the ones that liked it most, and you only get one point of view. And that's why this question of random sort of selection of who you talk to is a very important one. I hope I answered it a little bit, but basically one is the independence of the evaluator, and the second is the question of trying to get a representative sample and a random sample maybe of people that you interview for those types of things, even for the qualitative work, in fact.
Thank you, Kevin. Let me go ahead. We have a few questions coming. So the next question comes from Anne-Marie Kiaga, and she says, we work in the context of the Delivering as One, in which impact evaluation would need involvement of other UN agency. Mm-hmm. How does ILO's work get evaluated? So maybe I can take this one, Kevin, mm-hmm. But if you have something to add.
Okay.
Well, I think the ILO work gets evaluated or doesn't get evaluated as every other organization's work. I think we're more and more pushed for including evaluation or monitoring and evaluation plans in our proposals, and if funding usually gets included in the proposal for implementation, but many times it's not enough to do a big scale impact evaluation, and we need to go out and look for more donor funding to produce that type of evaluation and knowledge. So I hope I answered the question, and
maybe
Kevin, yes.
one thing to supplement it. I think the challenge you have is twofold. One is that you have UN agencies in that case working together. So a number of partners can be UN agencies, but you have a similar project if it's partners working together on something. We have a number of agencies working together to achieve either to run a specific program or to at least achieve common objectives. And so the question is, how do you disentangle sort of what each of them contributed? And that you won't do through a sort of scientific impact evaluation. For that, it's really, that's where you need a more qualitative approach combined with the monitoring of each of them as to see really how did the different organizations work together, were they efficient, did they meet their own targets, were timelines met, and all of that. The other question, though, is, well, what is it you're working on actually? What is the program you're working together on? And there, you may very well have, let's say, it could be could be a joint sort of a youth employment type of intervention, or it could be of any other sector, frankly. But it may be a very concrete program that you're working on together, that you're supporting together. And so you have a separate learning objective, which is that program that we are all collaborating on actually successful? And that's one type of approach, not to disentangle what the ILO's contribution was, but to see that that project that we are supporting and that hopefully someone in the government is owning, is that actually working? And then what that requires is to bring in, and that's a challenge often, and that is where sort of the political elements come in, is can you bring those different stakeholders together to agree with the government, with whoever is running it, to actually do some sort of a scientific evaluation of that project, independently of who is funding it, right? And there's often many. But to actually know, is it what the ILO with others is supporting? Is that actually something that's working? And so this is where you see how you need to complement different evaluation approaches to get to different sorts of information. One type of evaluation is not going to answer all your questions. And that's why you have to be selective sometimes, and sometimes make difficult trade-offs to say, okay, we'll go for this one, and we recognize that this is answering those types of questions, but maybe not others.
Thank you, Kevin. Wes Schweiye, hope I'm reading the name right. So he says, I work in a region where some of the senior level government leaders involved in employment are not subject matter experts. When you explain the results of a more scientific experimental-based M&E approach, how do you ensure less sophisticated audience understand the methodology and don't get lost? How do you make the results understandable to those not familiar with statistics? How do you get participation and buy-in from those who have to implement? So this is, I think, a very interesting question. Kevin, what do you think?
Absolutely. I think that really goes to the heart of the challenge, which is to, well, one is subject matter expert. So, it's a question of the employment or whatever program. The other is the evaluation expert, right? And that's certainly where you have a lot of disparity. If you may very well be an expert on employment, but you may not be an expert on evaluation, and I think that's totally fine and legitimate and understandable. And this is part of the reason why we try to come up with this guide, is to also explain some of the concepts around impact and attribution in a more intuitive way, right? There's a lot of methodologies, and it often gets very technical, etc. But frankly, the intuition behind those methods is a relatively simple one, and that one can explain without any statistics and without any math. And you know, I've just talked for myself, and maybe that's why I found this project so interesting and why we got involved. I do not have a PhD in economics or statistics or so, but I do think that this is a very important matter in evaluation. So how do we bring that language that has been owned more by PhD background colleagues, how do we bring that to an audience of a policymaker? And so this is where I think this more intuitive sort of notion of explaining some of those methods is important. I do believe that, let's say, if we take experimental methods, and we don't have to call them that, but basically this, the situation is we cannot serve everyone at once, and so let us try to be fair, and in fact that's a notion that often resonates. Instead of having cronyism, etc., be responsible for who's in the program and who's not, let's be very transparent and fair in the selection, that if people meet the eligibility criteria but there are too many people, then let's basically draw names out of a hat to see who will get it now and maybe who will get it later. And not only is that very fair and transparent, but it also helps you with the evaluation because you can well compare those two groups. And this is just one example of having a method that you, if you want to, you can make it very complicated and explain what it's all about. In reality, the core of it is relatively simple. And so this is what we try to do here, those 6 impact evaluation methods. We explain all of them on I think 2 or 3 pages to make them more intuitive and to have people have a better sense of what they're all about, and to then be able to think about whether that's something that could work in their project context, because not every method will work in every type of program. So that's one. So I fully agree that there is a need to explain some of those things in a more intuitive way, but I do think it's possible. So how to make the results understandable? I think it's the same. It's a similar questions. One, you have those, and I think that's something we see in practice. One, specific evaluations, and you don't need to present it with in massive statistical tables, but to show the comparison that those who participated had that outcome and those who were waitlisted had a different outcome. The size of government and other officials is like, wow, this is what's happening, right? This program, they have a 50% higher chance of graduating from high school, or to find employment, or they have 20% higher incomes. Those are, you know, you don't need a PhD to understand some of those results, and it's a question of communicating some of it. And so to your last question, getting the buy-in, that's very important though, because and it brings us back to the whole question is how do you make sure you can even implement some of those evaluations? You do need the buy-in from those stakeholders, and sometimes it's tricky, because they may feel, well, it's a rigorous evaluation. What happens if we get negative results, right? Is it going to reflect badly on us and all of that? And this is where you cannot get around that stakeholder discussion as to what is it that people want to learn. And if you come in with the question of the learning, I think it is for many intuitive, and they do want to know what that particular program is achieving. And to know what that particular program is achieving, you need to be able to compare to something. And for the results to be credible, you need to be able to not just look at what's happening to the people you're treating, because weather and other influences and whatever it may be may change the results in a good or in a bad way. So being able to have a somewhat more credible method of evaluation actually can, you know, be in the very interest of that government official. And so, so this initial discussion with stakeholders to get agreement on what you want to get out of a specific evaluation and what you want to learn, if you get that, then it automatically sort of leads you to the type of evaluation you will get. And I think, again, that doesn't have to be a technical, super technical discussion. On a very intuitive level is already informative and can work.